What's going on, everybody? And happy Black History Month. It's your boy Tate, aka Mr. Big Head. I am here with YaLife Media and Marketing, presenting Black Brilliance Now. That's right, Black Brilliance Now, where we are interviewing some of God's best, as my grandmother would say, but also just some of the Black luminaries, artists, educators, and examples of our time that is so pertinent for Black History Month. And so I'm super excited to be with and to be in community with one of my favorite people and one of God's best, Dr. Joel Kemp. Super excited to chat with him on today. So come on in, welcome in, Dr. Kemp. How are you feeling on today?
Doing well. It's good to be with you again, Tate, and it's nice to be a part of this production. Look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, when I was introduced to this initiative, when I heard the word brilliance, I'm not gonna lie, I immediately thought of some of the most impactful individuals that I have met, and you were one of them. And
Thank
I
you.
just want to really just highlight, how great your work has been in the academy, but also just to the Black community. So for you, when you hear Black Brilliance Now, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, part of what it means to me is that it's a way of countering a lot of the lie of white supremacy we hear. The
Mm,
idea that Blackness and brilliance don't belong together. And it's a reminder that Black folk have been brilliant for millennia. And so it's nice to be able to highlight that and to see kind of the legacy that we are inheriting from, the Dr. Kings, the Fannie Lou Hamers, Ida B.
yeah.
Wells, Frederick Douglasses, Howard Thurmans, et cetera, that we're inheriting this great tradition and trying to kind of to carry the baton or one lap around the track before we pass it on to someone else. So that's kind of what immediately comes to mind for me.
Yes, I love that you framed it that way. And also and I told you this before, your voice is amazing. So I'm gonna start calling you Dr. Kemp, aka the voice. It's
Right.
like it's so it just stops you in your tracks. And so beyond the profound words that you say, your tone gets our attention. So I appreciate
Does.
that. But I know I've talked a little bit about who you are for me, but could you tell our audience a little bit about your background and the journey to where you are now?
Sure. So I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I'm a diehard Steelers fan.
Okay,
Uh,
okay.
so I grew up in what's called the Hill District of Pittsburgh, which is one of the large Black communities there. My parents, Jesse and Loretta Kemp, were both kind of Christian educators, and actually did Sunday school literature for the church that I attended for most of my childhood. So I was very early in my life kind of shaped by kind of the church and Christianity, education, then being kind of deeply rooted in the community.
Mm,
So that kind of always fueled me. And so then fast forward for years, went away to college, both undergrad and law school did up in the Cambridge area, and then practiced law for about half a dozen years in a large law firm in Boston, and then left that to go to seminary to kind of finish my training in call to ministry. And while I was in seminary and doing kind of youth and young adult ministry in a number of Black Baptist churches in Massachusetts, really just got this kind of academic itch.
mm,
But the debate for me as I was going through seminary is, will I be a pastor who kind of moonlights in the academy or a professor who kind of moonlights in the church? And
mm.
ultimately, for me, just kind of felt led to have my home be in the academy. And so ultimately that culminated in me getting a PhD in Hebrew Bible. And that's kind of where I am now. It's led me to be at Candler School of Theology, affiliated with Emory University. So that's
Yeah,
sort of the bio in 20 seconds.
that is amazing. I mean, you skipped over a lot. And I do want to highlight that you have a JD from Harvard,
Correct.
correct?
Yeah.
And
And
an
I did my
AU
undergrad
program
there as well. Yeah,
as
exactly.
well. And so I mean, if that ain't Black excellence and Black brilliance, I don't know what is, right? But could you just speak to a little bit about your motivations? What got you on this track of academic excellence? Was it your parents? Was it things that you picked up in the community, or things that you read? Like, what pushed
Yeah.
Joel to go into the route that you went?
Yeah, I think the things you named are all part of it, right? So
Mm,
certainly my parents. It's always joke with a couple of friends that my parents are those parents that if you have a question, they don't give you an answer, they give you a book.
okay, okay.
And so I always remember, I was like 12, 13, and starting to really wrestle with these questions about Christianity, Blackness in America.
Mm,
And my dad's response was, here's a book called Is God a White Racist?
wow.
And that was my summer reading, when I was like 12, 13.
Wow.
So that kind of impulse of, if you have a question, you try to go dig and find resources for it, is very much a part of kind of the scholarly impulse that was cultivated in me.
Mm,
Then probably the other major moment is when I was a junior in college, getting ready to go into my senior year. I ended up writing a senior thesis.
okay.
And so I got a chance to have as my two primary advisors, Dr. Cornell West and Dr. Alan Callahan. And so to be a 20,
Well, wait a
20
minute now. Wait. You just dropped that like it's just normal,
Right.
right? I think
Yeah.
Dr. Cornel West is running for president this year,
Yes.
I think, right? So just that alone, like, what was that relationship like? How did that inform your scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that they were for me, in addition to being kind of brilliant minds and kind of astute critics, I saw myself in places I never imagined.
Wow.
Right. And so what does Black brilliance mean? One of your first questions. Well, one of the things it means is providing a model, an example that others can make it, and expanding people's horizons. So to sit in a room, Dr. Alan Callahan, Dr. Cornell West,
Mm.
and to have two Black Christian Harvard professors that you could sit and talk with, um, changed my perspective on the world. So what was kind of a wish became a hope because I saw it fulfilled in the two of them.
Wow. Woo! Representation, right?
Yeah.
Like that truly really impacts young people especially, but especially those who are in the academy and when you find yourself to feel not as motivated or not want to continue having those pillar of lights, right? Just enough light. We're gonna get into that, but when you can get that when you can have that in your pathway to see folks who have navigated different difficulties and crises and have made it to where they are, that is quite profound, and that can really do a lot for someone. That for me, I'm an alum of where you teach at Candler School of Theology, and for me, Gregory Ellison was that for me.
Yeah.
Like being able to see like Black men who were still also very approachable, right? Not so lofty, not so like unapproachable, but just someone who is just down home, but also just
Yeah.
very passionate and indebted to the work. And the scholarship was really motivating for me. So to hear that from you is quite profound.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think all of us, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And
Yes.
so one of the things that was kind of inspiring, as you said, for me was, again, what does it do 20, 19, 21 to be in their presence, to take not just take classes with them, but to be able to sit and have coffee with them and talk about what I'm thinking about with Du Bois, what I'm thinking about with Booker T, what I'm thinking about with kind of James Cone and others, right? So those kinds of conversations, and to be respected. Clearly, I was not an intellectual equal. Let's not be crazy at 20, but to be respected as a young scholar with promise, right?
Yeah.
That kind of the level of confidence and grace that gives you carries you through a lot of the madness that you encounter along this journey.
I mean, you being quite humble. I mean, you have 2 degrees from Harvard, have a seminary degree, all of these things, and I'm curious to know, with all of the successes and the books that you have written, teaching various courses, how do you define success, and what motivates you to continue your work?
Yeah, for me, success is really about your impact on others, right? I often use the phrase, success is about character, not credentials. And so what I'm most interested in is, how do you help people become the best version of themselves?
Yeah.
And part of that motivation for me is rooted in my understanding of the person and work of Jesus Christ, right? And I love how you introduced it about one of God's best, right? That there's an old church father who talks about what God really wants is for all of us to be fully alive.
Wow.
And Dr. Howard Thurman
Howard Thurman, right?
picks up a similar thread in his work.
Yes.
And so for me, that's success, to help people truly come alive, to be the best versions of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that motivation to me is an eternal one, that just kind of keeps me going. Because again, people did that to me. And for generations that I'll not know on this side of life, who helped kind of support me and undergird me on this journey.
Absolutely. So it's interesting to hear you say success to frame success in that way, because many would say that, you know, success is about the degrees and, you know, the amount of money you have in your bank account, the things that you can actually accumulate, the things you can own and things like that. But to hear that character matters over credentials, right? Like that is so powerful. And I hope that those who are watching, especially our young folks, can really resonate with that and allow that to kind of sit with that, right? Because we are stressing ourselves out, especially as Black Americans, because we're always been told to be 10 steps better, or to be 10 steps ahead. You got to be better than your counterparts, right, in order to achieve and to even be in certain rooms, right? And so to hear that really speaks to me in a way that reminds me of like why I'm here, right? To leave this place better than what I found it. And so I'm also very curious to know that in the spaces that you have occupied, how have you been able to navigate your industry as a Black individual, and how have you overcome the trials and tribulations you may have faced?
Yeah, in some ways, I feel like that's a whole hour-long conversation in of itself.
I'm sure.
You know, I mean, the first thing is to just name that there are challenges that you will face, and that it's okay to acknowledge that sometimes you're tired, sometimes you have wounds in that. And to me, that was the first step, right? To have the humility and the courage to say, I'm hurt or I'm tired. And so that to me is not a place of weakness, but it's the only way to truly find strength, right? To invoke my grandmother, she would often say, as a Christian, you're strongest when you're weakest, because that's when you're on your knees. And it's from that place of being on your knees that you then are able to receive God's strength. And so part of it for me is just acknowledging that. Then the second thing, particularly in the work that I do that focuses on kind of Bible and race in America, is to recognize that the attacks, the critiques, some ways just the personal animus is evidence that the work I'm doing is both needed and is effective, right? My wife often uses the phrase, that means the dosage of the medicine is right. So for some of my white brothers and sisters who will call me racist when I talk about the history of America and its misuse of Christianity, yes, there's a sting to that, but it also is a good affirmation that says, okay, the fact that you are bothered by it, again, means the medicine is working. And so I try to reframe the attacks so that it's really not a me problem, it's a them problem. And for the work, it means the work is being effective. That if I'm pricking people's consciences by raising stories that aren't told or bringing analysis to things that haven't been at the forefront of certain kinds of scholarship, then that's doing the work. That's what all the credentials are for, right? It's again, I'm not saying if you can have a house, get a house. So no one is saying material things are bad, but those can't be the sole aim. That those have to be means to an end.
Absolutely. What comes to mind also is that I've heard someone say that credentials can get you in the door, but character is what sustains you. Are you able to keep what got you in the door? And so you being able to use your influence, but also your ability to speak truth to power in such a way that is palatable and authentic for white folks to sit and to take and digest is a gift within itself. And I really need a notepad because I need to be listening. I need to be taking notes because that's something I personally struggle with, because oftentimes we allow our hurt to kind of drive the way that we are making decisions, or how we or the feelings of feeling inadequate, or that I don't belong, or that I don't measure up, makes us either go far and beyond the call of duty and we're stressing ourselves out to try to prove that we belong there, or then we underperform, right? Because we are tired and we don't see any reasons to even rise up to the occasion. And so hearing you say that really just makes me want to know more about how do you balance, if balance exists in your world, but how do you find that medium? Because it seems like a
Oh
dance,
yeah,
right? Like having to really show up as a black man in a space like Emory, right? Like, and I can say that because I was there, where I felt many times that I did not belong.
yeah,
Like I felt like, God, why am I even
yeah,
here? You know, stressed out or either overworking, pulling all nighters in the library. But shout out to that library because it's 24 hours.
yes,
And you know, like just really just trying to figure out what is the meaning of this, right? And just trying to feel like I belong, right? When systems and everything else is saying I don't. So how do you deal with that and navigate those feelings in predicaments that you find yourself in, like the ivory
yeah,
tower?
absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is again acknowledging that those feelings are real, that the
Mm-hmm.
structures were built in this country for Black brilliance not to exist, right? And
Mm,
so, in some ways, we're asking a system that was never designed for us to now work with us, and so
yeah.
recognizing that that's a real battle takes a real toll. And so, part of how I've managed that, I've been blessed with a phenomenal wife,
Mm,
and I can be unfiltered around her, and she can be unfiltered around me. So that's one place. You need to have that moment where it's not
mhm,
Dr. Kemp, it's not minister this, it's not pastor that. You can just kind of not be on and just
mm,
be as vulnerable as you need to be to express whatever emotion you have in a safe space. And so that's
right.
one thing I encourage. Find the safe space. For me, again, it's
Mm,
in my own house. You may have to find it with friends, colleagues, pastors, therapists, all of the above to find that safe space. The second thing
mhm,
for me, and this is kind of a spiritual reframing piece that I mentioned a little bit earlier, of recognizing in attacks, what is God's affirmation? One of my
mhm,
favorite pastors who died a few years ago always used to say that wherever the devil attacks you publicly, God has first affirmed you privately. And so
mm,
for me, when I feel that sense of inadequacy, which I do, when I feel like I need to work twice as hard to get half as much, those kinds of things, I try to stop myself and say, so what's the affirmation that God has before that attack? And so that understanding, again,
mm,
what does Black brilliance mean? Well, that's how God created Black folk, right?
mhm,
That we are full of God's image and God's likeness. So therefore, our brilliance is just a secondary consequence of God's own brilliance. And so trying to
right.
ground myself in those kind of Christian practices that keep me centered. The third is I'm highly selective now about who I put in my circle. Meaning, like
Absolutely.
there are a lot of folk I'm cool with, but there are very few people that I trust. And by
Mm,
trust, I mean you're in my inner circle. And so, to me,
mhm,
being highly selective about that, and certainly one of the nice things of being a handler is I'm part of a long legacy of Black brilliance there. And so I
mhm,
have some of
mhm.
that to lean on. But even before that, having a few connections along the way that there are a couple people I can just call and say, hey, can I get 30 minutes? Everything's off the record, everything's good, and it stays between us. So that to
Right,
me has been part
right.
of it. Yeah.
Gems to live by. Listen, but I'm curious to know, just a side note, what does an unfiltered Dr. Kemp look like? Because I'm just curious to know.
Right. Well, so an unfiltered Dr. Kemp tends not to be very careful in the words that he chooses. Right.
Okay.
So, my grandmother had a strong prohibition on cursing because she thought if you
Okay.
did that, that meant you had a limited vocabulary. So,
Okay.
there are ways of saying things like this particular idea has a level of inanity that defies credulity.
Mm.
Or I can say that was the dumbest thing I heard in my life. Or I can say that's the dumbest thing and add a few expletives along the way. So
Right.
the unfiltered Dr. Kemp says that's the dumbest thing I've heard, and occasionally may add an expletive.
Got it.
I try
Got
not
it.
to,
Okay.
in honor of my grandmother, so when she looks down from heaven, I don't want her to be like, what happened to my to my grandson?
Right. That's helpful, and it humanizes
Yeah,
us, right? And I'm sure if your students watch this, you'll be like, oh, okay, like I can get with
right.
that, right? And you mentioned your wife. You mentioned a little other practices that you do to kind of center yourself. You also mentioned tiredness and how we as Black folk just navigating this country and these systems that exist can become tired, right? Um, I'm thinking about Rest is Resistance with
Yes.
Tricia Hersey. Shout out to her, graduate of Candler School of Theology. And that has kind of been like my guiding light for 2023. And I will continue to read that book. And so I'm curious to know, how do you center rest with all the demands of your work? How do you center rest and find rejuvenation?
Yeah, no, great question. I think part of the rest comes at three levels for me. Number one is certainly coming out of my corporate legal background. Rest was almost something you did when you were weak, or you
Mm,
rested only when you collapsed, right? And so one of the things that kind of the spiritual practices is that rest is something God commands, right? If we go back to
mm,
like the creation story, again, Hebrew Bible scholars, so obviously have to have the Hebrew Bible in my mind, right? The last thing God did was rest. And so what does it mean for the creator to sow into creation a commandment to rest? And so for
mm,
me, rest is as important as the work that so part of what that looks like practically is my goal is 1 hour every day, 1 day every week, 1 week every month where I rest.
okay.
And that rest can mean throwing on the TV and watching random spy TV shows. It can be watching
Okay.
old cartoons from my childhood. It can
Hmm.
be, going to a nice dinner with my wife or taking like a weekend trip to a beach or something. But it's really just
Mm,
unplugging from the world as much as I can. I turn off my phone, don't check my email. Those wonderful focus filters are great. So that way, if there's an emergency, there's a way for folk to get through that filter, but I just turn it all off and try to let my mind and heart just kind of recharge. And so it's that
yeah.
principle: 1 hour every day, 1 day every week, 1 week every month, where I unplug. And that I don't do that every hour, every day, every week, every month, but most months I do. And it makes a
Mm,
huge difference.
yeah. Yeah. That's super helpful. I'm trying to get better at that. I feel like and Trisha's book is really helpful because it really combats this grind
Yeah.
culture, right? That we find ourselves in. And again, as Black folks, we are, always trying to fight every day, every literally sometimes I wake up before I go to work. I'm like, what battles I'm gonna have to
Yeah.
fight today,
Yeah.
right? What fires I'm gonna have to take out
Exactly.
today. And so and it's almost to the point where I feel guilty if I were to take a day off, or if I were to call in and say, or I'm coming in late, or things like that. So I'm trying to be better at that. So hearing you say that as someone who has the level that you're at is where I one day would love to be. But in honesty, I think that where I am right now is like, I don't know if I'll ever get there based on where I am right
Right.
now because I'm already tired. But maybe putting in those strategies that you have just shared will be helpful. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. And also,
Thinking about,
I was gonna say also
yeah, go
kind of
ahead.
part of I think what I found, and I know in some of our conversations we've talked about it, that often there's a part of the work that's energizing. And so one of the things
Mm,
that I often try to do is I guard that part, right? That
mhm,
there's a big football fan I mentioned, Steelers. So Mike Tomlin
mhm,
always has this phrase about uh, football is our game, winning is our business. And so this idea of separating your business from your passion, although they are often connected if you're a professional football player. And
right.
so for me, a lot of the things I study are things I would do anyway. I just also happen to
Mm,
get a check with it. Some of the
mhm,
things that I would do in the community, I would do anyway before I got a check.
mhm,
And so that to me is one of those things that helps keep me going. And I know from many of my colleagues keeps us going is that there's a power and a purpose in the work itself. And as we get a chance to develop in our careers to find that intersection, then you find that you come alive doing that, which doesn't eliminate the battles, but it lessens the toll they take.
Absolutely, absolutely. Words to live by. And I'm curious to know, as we are in the month of February and celebrating Black History Month, if there are certain individuals or maybe even movements within Black history that has inspired you or even influenced your writings and your work.
Yeah, definitely. The challenge for me is always, I feel like every period I study, I find a new Black hero or heroine that I'm like, oh, I need to do more on that. So it's
Yeah.
kind of, the short answer is basically everyone I encounter in some way.
Okay.
But to narrow it down, the two that have kind of been with me the longest, really three, from 19th century, Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. And then from the 20th century, Dr. Howard Thurman. Now, those are the three that have been kind of with me the longest. And I think with each of them, what I found kind of most life-giving, most encouraging, most fortifying is that all of them found ways to be deeply committed in their own ways to the Christian tradition, but also deeply critical of its misappropriation in America. And they connected those two things to service of our people. And to me, that's what I want to be, and that's what I want to do, right? Is to have that deep engagement, unassailable critiques, and kind of uncompromising commitment to our people. And I think if I can do that, then I've lived a life worth it.
Wow, wow. What advice would you give someone, especially our young Black gifted youth and even young adults? What advice would you give them as they aspire to the different fields that they may be in, creatives? Even someone like me, as I mentioned before, I would love to be where you are one day, but I recognize that everyone has their own path, right? And God gives us just enough light, right?
Yeah.
Based on our individual pathway. And with that, as I keep punting that, I would love for you to also share a little bit about your institute and how impactful in the work that you're doing through that institute.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I'll start with kind of the advice. There are a couple of things that were said to me that I've kind of remixed that I think that I try to pass on to others because I think it's been helpful for me. The first is to find ways of not letting the attacks on you become your own self-image, right? So that I am more than the attacks on my intelligence. I am more than the attacks on my personhood. And so to not spend my life in defensive mode, understanding you are kind of under attack, but not to try to live on that defensive mode, but instead, what are those things that you feel called to pursue? And let that positive drive kind of be the driving force for you. Second thing in that line is when I was in high school, I had a chance to meet black male lawyers who are probably about 40 years older than me at the time. And one of them said to me, never make a choice today that closes a good door. And so that idea of kind of never making a choice today that closes a good door, like in Christian parlance, we talk about discernment, right? That you want to make sure you're putting yourselves in the best opportunities to grow, to get the skills you need to do the work you want to do. The third is to remain open to how that work you've been called to do will change, right? So if we had this interview, 2005, I would have told you, Tate, I'm going to be a pastor of a church, and I'll be doing these kinds of things in the community. Being a professor wasn't on my radar, other than maybe I'll do a class every now and again. But as I kind of continued down this road, God became clear to me that, standing in front of a podium, teaching people can happen in pulpits and in podiums.
Wow.
So, don't narrow what God means when God says this is what I've called you to do. That it can take a very different form. And so had I fought against God and kind of died on the hill of being in a pulpit, I would have missed the podium. And
Wow.
that podium has in some ways opened pulpits that I never would have imagined.
Mm.
And I think to me, that's sort of a segue into your question about JEL. So JEL Institute, Just Enough Light Institute. Institute started about 2 years ago now. And the goal is really to bring some of the knowledge that I've gained through studying the Hebrew Bible and its context, its languages, etc., to brothers and sisters who are in churches, who are in seminaries, who are pastors. But often we don't have access to seminary education, or if we do, we've gone through it, and now we're out in ministry, and you don't have time to kind of take those deep dives that you may have wanted to. And so what I try to do is provide both on one-on-one consultations and in podcasts and other kind of study materials, ways of diving into that, so that the work that I have done can hopefully feed the work you do in feeding congregations and feeding your own soul. So it's really just a chance to bring, again, the academy and church together in service of our community. And too often they are divided.
Absolutely.
That's what JEL was trying to do.
That's awesome. And are you working with specific like Black churches or just any congregation and just congregations in general?
There's congregations in general, but my focus is really on the black churches. That's where my heart is. That's where my passion is. And certainly kind of equipping us, as we were talking throughout this conversation, against the barrage that we face on a daily basis. It's important that our churches be places of refuge. One scholar likes to talk about the Black church as an incubator of hope. So I want to make sure we incubate hope as best we can.
Absolutely. Now, I know that you are on sabbatical, but you're doing some writings. Would you tell us and share with us quickly what are some things that's coming down the pipeline that we can be looking forward to from JEL?
Sure. The main project I'm working on right now is my second book, which is called Blackness in 3D.
Okay.
Biblical Race, American Law, and Contemporary Crime.
Wow.
So again, Blackness in 3D, Biblical Race, American Law, and Contemporary Crises. The goal here is to look at how the Bible's been used to create whiteness and Blackness in America, and how that construction of whiteness and Blackness found repository in our legal system, and how that then shapes a lot of the encounters that we face today as Black men and Black women in the context of police, criminal justice, et cetera. So it's really trying to connect biblical exegesis with 21st century challenges that produced the Black Lives Matter movement, the civil rights movement of the 20th century, Reconstruction of the 19th century. So that's in 15 seconds what I'm working on.
That is amazing, and it's quite needed. And I'm excited about it. It's fascinating, and I can't wait for it to come out. And I am just so grateful for the opportunity to have chatted with you in this brief moment. We could go hours and hours just talking about some of the works that you have done, and even just your critique on the Black church in the 21st century. But hopefully they'll come in a different episode. But I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for what you have shared with us on today, and thank you to YaLife Media and Marketing. We are here to celebrate Black Brilliance Now, and we're doing it all month long. So happy Black History Month, and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.